Today we're going to talk about Hellenistic Cosmopolitanism. So if you look at the timeline here, we're kind of talking about the area from the end of classical Greece through Alexander the Great's empire, the Hellenistic period, which is after that. And then the second half of the lecture, I'll be talking a little bit about Buddhist art, and I swear it's related, you'll see. And we'll be talking about two pieces of art, one that was created around 100 CE and one that's created around 200 CE. So that's kind of the time period that we'll be covering today. We derive our word cosmopolitan from cosmopolite, which is Greek for citizen of the world. The idea that all humans in the world make up a global community is not a new one. We tend to think of the ancients as people bound by a lack of technology and knowledge about the world, and in some ways this is true, but for the most part this is not an accurate way of thinking about ancient people. I hope this has become clear as you've progressed through this module. Many early peoples, nomadic hominids, oceanic voyagers, or even early merchants or traders experienced the pull of globalization to an extent. By the time of classical Greece, which we covered in Module 1, the idea of a global community had gained enough traction that philosophers were debating its merits. Plato and Aristotle's philosophies dominated ancient Greek life, and they were decidedly uncosmopolitan. Both Plato and Aristotle advocated loyalty to one's polis. People were supposed to serve and be served by their polis and didn't owe anything to foreigners or outsiders. But other Greek philosophers disagreed. Hippias, for example, said in one of Plato's dialogues to foreigners in the room, quote, "Gentlemen present, I regard you all as kinsmen, familiars, and fellow citizens, by nature and not by convention, for like is by nature akin to like," end quote. Greeks, and later the Romans, argued over whether one's ultimate loyalty lay with one's village, one's province, or one's empire. As polities became larger and more complex, so did this question. The group of philosophers who were most successful at popularizing the idea of cosmopolitanism was the Stoics. The Stoics believed that everyone had two communities, that of their birth and that of humankind. This makes a lot of sense if you think about it, since the Greeks were known for their doctrine of humanism, which is appreciating the human form and the human mind. So it makes sense that they would envision a community based on humanity. So your membership to this community is just that you were a human. The Stoics' philosophy of cosmopolitanism found political purchase when Alexander the Great came to power as king of Imperial Macedonia in 336 BCE. 2 years after he inherited the throne, Alexander conquered all of Anatolia, including the Aegean city-state, so he conquered Greece. He then set his sights on the Persian Empire, conquering Persia, Babylon, and making incursions all the way to the Indus River Valley by the time he was 10 years into his reign. He died 2 years later, which ignited a scramble for power over the empire among his top generals. This massive empire sat under a single administration, which fostered interactions between many cities and provinces that had previously had little to do with each other on a daily basis. A generation of cosmopolitan nobles emerged, important dignitaries and businessmen who traveled across the massive empire, absorbing the cultures of faraway lands and uniting with people who had previously been foreigners under different empires. Alexander the Great was Greek educated, his tutor was Aristotle, and he regarded the Greeks as the most culturally and intellectually advanced society of their time. To this end, he and his underlings spread Greek culture to all the areas they conquered. This process was called Hellenization. Hellenism refers to the study or imitation of classical Greek culture. After Alexander died and the empire was split into several successor states by his fighting generals, this process of Hellenistic cosmopolitanism continued. The economic and cultural bonds that had been forged during Alexander's lifetime remained intact for hundreds of years. It became increasingly common for people to subordinate their loyalty to their town or religion in favor of becoming a citizen of the world, traveling, borrowing elements of different cultures, but the character of this cosmopolitanism was decidedly Greek. The world was diverse, vast, and connected by economic and cultural ties, but it was a heavily Hellenized world. During this time, it was difficult for any single empire to dominate this area, and this is why the time between Alexander's death and the rise of the Roman Empire is known as the Hellenistic period. In some areas, this Hellenization was a permanent fixture of their culture now. So the impact of this Hellenistic world is evident when we look at Buddhist sculpture over the next few hundred years. See, for example, here, the Gandhara Buddha. Gandhara was a kingdom in modern northern Pakistan. Alexander ruled over Gandhara during the latter part of his campaign, and this was precisely the point in time when Buddhism reached the kingdom of Gandhara as well. The Gandhara Buddha was created sometime around 100 CE, sometime between 100 CE and 200 CE, we're not exactly sure. This is more than 400 years after the death of Alexander, but the Hellenic influence on this Indian kingdom is still very apparent. This is one of the first depictions of the Buddha in human form, but it's not an Indian style at all. It looks decidedly Greek. Look at this comparison of a Gandhara Buddha with the Apollo Belvedere sculpture from Greece. You can see they look really similar. The Gandhara sculpture is anatomically correct and three-dimensional. The Buddha wears a Greek-style toga, and its many folds are accentuated in the stone. His hair is thick and wavy, pulled away from his face and gathered at the top of his head, and his face has the dignified, gracious structure common to classical sculpture. His eyelids are heavy and hang dreamily over his large eyes. His nose is straight, and his cheekbones are high. His lips are practically identical to those of Apollo, small, plump, shapely, and loosely pursed. Now, compare the Gandhara Buddha to a Buddha made in Mathura, which is 620 miles northeast, around the same time. The Buddha images from Mathura, though constructed in the same century as the Gandhara Buddhas, are fashioned in an exclusively Indian style that paved the way for the art of the Gupta Empire a few centuries later, and would lay the foundation for Eastern-style art in the coming millennia. In the century following the construction of these Buddha images, the municipalities, both Gandhara and Mathura, were enveloped into the Kushan Empire and became its two urban centers. The Mathura Buddha wears his hair pulled tight and coiled into a knot on top of his head. This hairstyle, called a kaparda coil, is a snail-like coil of hair pulled tightly from the face and twisted into a mound on top of the head. This was a hairstyle often worn by ascetics in ancient India. His hair is not wavy or curly. His limbs and torso show no muscular definition, though his shoulders are broad compared to his tiny waist. The Mathura Buddha image has a face that resembles ethnic Indians as opposed to the straight-nosed Gandhara Buddha, who resembles ethnic Greeks. The Mathura Buddha has a rounded, more boyish face and a flatter, wider nose. He wears a contented facial expression that's never seen in the stoically serious and painfully contemplative faces of some Gandharan and most Greek statues. He's less physically attractive in the classical sense of the term, but he possesses a genuine, friendly charm that the Gandhara Buddha lacks. Based on the Gantara Buddha and many artifacts like it, as well as documentary evidence of travel and exchange, scholars have been able to trace Hellenistic trade networks. But it's important to remember that trade networks don't only forge economic ties, they forge cultural ones. This is why people in the Hellenistic world were cosmopolitan. They viewed themselves as citizens of the world rather than as strictly Greek or Buddhist or Indian or Macedonian or whatever. People were more willing than ever before, and more than they would be in the coming centuries, to explore, combine, and exalt the several different cultures at once, going beyond national borders, religious difference, and geographical boundaries. Hopefully this sounds sort of familiar to you, and it makes you kind of think of the process of globalization that happened in the digital turn. So now that people are connected by digital technology, you can have these connections with people of other cultures, and geography doesn't get in the way. This is sort of an earlier version of that globalization in this cosmopolitan world that we live in now. So one more comment I want to make is that, interestingly, this early surge in cosmopolitan identities may have influenced the formation and the success of the Roman Empire. Roman Stoics, in a creative twist of theirs, came to define the Roman Empire as the world. And they suggested that Roman citizens owed their loyalty and energies to the world, meaning the empire, rather than to their respective localities. So people felt like they were very cosmopolitan sorts of citizens, but really they were sort of just working as agents of empire. This school of thought helped to support the workings of empire and strengthen the loyalty of Roman citizens to the government. So, as much as cosmopolitanism worked against empire during the Hellenistic period, remember I told you it was really hard for any one power to take over that whole area at once, it worked in favor of empire when it came to Rome a couple hundred years later. And this is a reminder that the same philosophy can be used for different and sometimes opposing aims. So I want you to keep that in mind as you progress through the course.